So good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad you could join us today. My name is Professor Ian Wood. I'm the Professor of Molecular Neuroscience in the Faculty of Biological Sciences at the University of Leeds, and also the Pro Dean International for the faculty. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual seminar of the Global Food and Environment Institute, How to Make Agriculture Food Systems Resilient to Climate Change, Lessons Learned from AFRICAP. It will be presented by Professor Tim Benton. Professor Benton is the Research Director for Emerging Risks and the Director of the Environment and Society Programme at the Royal Institute of International Affairs at Chatham House. He is also the Professor of Population Ecology here at the University of Leeds. Professor Benton joined Chatham House in 2016 as a Distinguished Visiting Fellow, at which time he was also the Dean of Strategic Research Initiatives at the University of Leeds. From 2011 to 2016, he was also the champion of UK's Global Food Security Programme, which is a multi-agency partnership between UK government departments and the research councils with an interest in the challenges around food. AFRICAP is Leeds' largest global challenges research fund programme, and it's aimed at creating climate-smart agriculture and food systems. Since 2017, the team has produced evidence on what makes these systems resilient to climate change, and they've worked hard to communicate the evidence to policy and decision makers around the world. The work has mainly focused around Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania and Zambia, but the findings are applicable to all of the Southern African region. Today in this webinar, we will hear about these key findings from the work and the recommendations that they have for future research. The Global Food and Environment Institute here at Leeds is an interdisciplinary research community which brings together members from across academia, industry and public policy to work on the challenges of food security as well as climate change. For further information on the GFEI, please visit the website, and there's a link in the chat to do so. This seminar is also part of a series of seminars. Please check the chat function with a link to the series advertised on Eventbrite. And also the website for in the Leeds, University of Leeds and Global Food. And there's also our Twitter feed at Global Food Leeds for more information. So lastly, can I just remind everybody about seminar etiquette? Please ensure your cameras and microphones are switched off for the duration of the seminar. The presentation will take around 20 minutes. If you've got any questions, please pop those into the chat function addressed to everybody. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a 10-minute question and answer session. And as chair, I'll collate the questions from the chat function. Can I also remind you that the seminar is being recorded, and we will make a recording available via YouTube after the seminar. I think that's enough from me. So now I'm very glad to introduce Professor Tim Benton for his presentation. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks very much, Ian. I must start off with an apology, and that is given where the world is and given where development is, I can't cover the kind of whole richness of the topic in 20 minutes. So this is very much a kind of partial presentation, with the first third being really about what issues framed the project to start off with, and then how the project worked, with some reflections at the end about some of the findings and what I conclude from the project. And of course, this being a project that has, I don't know, 20 institutions involved and huge numbers of people involved, this is the project is not my project. It's never been my project. This is the result of extremely tight teamwork across multiple institutions. So I will aim to finish before 12:30, allowing time for questions. But that might mean that I have to skip over some of the things. But anyway, starting off at the beginning, we know that our global food systems aren't working for a variety of reasons. They are environmentally unsustainable, and they don't do their primary task, which is to deliver nutrition security for people all around the world. And this map on the right-hand side just illustrates the ill health costs coming from our food system. In terms of the darker colors, higher dietary related mortality. And this is undernutrition, micronutrient deficiency, and the diseases associated with obesity and overweight coming from eating too much of the wrong sorts of things. I just point you to the asterisks by the 142 to 189 in terms of the age standardized mortality rate. That is, roughly speaking, where COVID mortality fell on a global basis in 2020. And what you can see from looking at the map, for much of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, they live year in, year out with poor dietary health, increasing obesity, but also, as particularly in the Horn of Africa at the moment, a lack of access to any food at all. And you know, the world has made an enormous fuss on a weekly basis about COVID. It doesn't make that fuss on poor dietary health, whether in the global north or the global south. And our interconnected global food system is also, as well as dysfunctional in the sense of externalizing costs onto health systems and environmental systems, it is also incredibly fragile. This pie diagram, set of pie diagrams at the top, is about where agricultural losses arise from climate-related impacts and other environmental disasters. But what you can see for the sub-Saharan Africa on the left-hand side, the majority of issues associated with agricultural production are to do with droughts. And as we look ahead in the future of climate change, then clearly droughts are going to become more common, heat waves are likely to become more common, and we are going to be in a situation where the fragility of the system makes things much, much worse. And so building resilience is key. And on a global basis, we're all recognizing this at the moment with the global impacts coming from the Ukraine war, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So one of the kind of starting points for the project as a whole was to say that, well, if we're doing research now to make the world a better place, that research realistically is not going to make much of a difference for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever time it takes to scale out. So we have to be reasonably confident that the world in 10, 20, 30 years time is going to be fit for the sorts of things that we're researching on. Or putting that another way, we have to research the questions that will be needed in the future, not the questions we think we need now. And so part of where we are is to think about what will the future look like, and then backtrack to today and say, what are the research challenges associated with decisions made now that play out with decades to come? And just as a brief aside, we tend to think as people, we're very linear thinkers, that tomorrow is always going to be like today and next year is going to be like this year. But if you look across the sorts of world-changing events that have been happening with increasing frequency over the last 10 years particularly, what you can see is that the world is in a very different place today than where we would have assumed it would have been even 10 years ago, pre-Brexit, pre-Trump, pre-Ukraine, and so on. And just to emphasize that, in 2017, I think it was, we did a scenarios exercise looking at the future of food systems, and we thought that the most uncertain axes, uncertain driving forces were to do with the extent of globalization or deglobalization and the way that diets may shift from unsustainable and unsustainable to sustainable and healthy diets. And we put together this diagram at the time, and we said, well, if the world continues on where it's going, if it's increasingly stable, increasingly globally interconnected, etc., you would expect more global markets. And then on the right-hand side, this downwards red arrow, these are the sorts of things that we listed 5 years ago now in terms of what might drive the world into a place where where food systems are really challenged by a deglobalization agenda. The growth of protectionism and nationalism. We've seen that with Trump and Bolsonaro and Brexit and so on. Breakup of rules-based international cooperation. The UN is creaking, WTO is creaking, etc. War, terrorism, etc. Ukraine. We're in this situation now. And in the kind of circles where I walk, there is a lot of discussion about how different will the world be post-Ukraine, post-COVID, etc. And can we take for granted anymore, and the answer is no, that we're going to work towards a world where we're more interconnected by trade. So if you just take these two quadrants to illustrate the point, if you're thinking about the research agenda of sustainable healthy diets in a globalized world versus a regionalized world, you end up with very different shapes to the food system. In the top one, you'd have global comparative advantage, growing crops in the best region in the world, exporting them around the world, long supply chains, large scale, intensive agriculture. In the bottom one, because you're not exporting food all around the world, you have to grow more of the diversity of crops that you need from a healthy diet perspective. So you'd need to produce more varied food locally. You'd have to have more varied farming systems. There'd be smaller scale. You wouldn't have the benefits of large-scale agricultural efficiency, so you'd have to concentrate on waste. You'd have to link better agricultural policy to health policy and so on. And you'd need, therefore, very different innovation solutions to come out of that. So just as before we go on to the kind of AFRICAP focus bit, Ukraine is a moment or a decade, because it will last at least a decade in terms of not just the crisis, but the geopolitical consequences thereof. It is an event that might be world changing in terms of knocking us from one course to another course. Clearly, it's leading to a very big food, fertilizer, energy spike, but it might cause economies to bring onshore their production that they would normally trade for, and lead to more regionalization or deglobalization. And it might drive new geopolitical and therefore geostrategic and trade reconfigurations, particularly with some risk of there being a bipolar world of two big blocs competing with each other, which are trading more internally between themselves rather than across the two big blocs. So in a world where actually your trading partners aren't increasing but are going down rapidly, you can't rely on trade to fulfill local needs. You have to make sure your domestic production and the trading world match up better. We will be in a very, very different place. And so Ukraine and Russia potentially offers us a significant opportunity, or will force us to think in very different ways about the future of agriculture and the future of trade, particularly this balance between what do you produce at home and what do you import and what do you export and so on. So that's all preface. And now on to AFRICAP. So the first thing is that funding from GCRF, we have multiple partners, both in the UK, Aberdeen Met Office, Chatham House, and the home base at University of Leeds. Many academics involved, many PhD students, many support staff. It's been a fantastically interesting institutional journey. And then in the global south, in Africa, we have FANRAPAN as our major partner, which is a Pan-African organization which manages local institutions in target countries to interface with local communities and local policymakers. And our local communities are CSANET in Malawi, NAMC in South Africa, ESRF in Tanzania, and ACF in Zambia. And it's very much, and the layout of the logos is deliberate, it is very much an equal partnership of all of the players, and that is a very important lesson to start off with. So the real challenge that we tried to tackle with AFRICAP was, given some of the complexity that I've talked about in terms of we need to transform the food system, we need to make it more climate resilient, we need to think about land use, because land use is being competed for, whether it's for carbon storage or for nature or for other uses. Biofuels, for example, the more land we use, the less there is for other things, the more emissions come out. We also need to make sure that what is grown is not just fit for export markets, but is also fit for the nutrition security of the local population. So there are trade and nutrition trade-offs. How do all of these things come together to determine the shape of policy level decisions about what should be grown, what should be supported from an agricultural perspective? And our overall aim, as per the right-hand bullet point, was to think about how we can create some sort of decision support tool mechanism for integrating systems level policy making for development by putting all the pieces together in one place. And this is a figure from the overall project final report, which is available on the website. And I think I've got a link into it later on. But this is effectively the journey that we set out to do. It's about growing capability. So how can we understand the challenges in different fields? How can we work together as a crop molecular biologist? How can they work with a climate change person or a trade specialist to think about yields in the future, or a nutritionist? How can we build that capacity to make these decisions? How can we think about what the shape of the future will be to determine how to shape the vision for what agriculture should be under a development pathway? Is it about growing as much as possible, exporting it, importing what you're not growing, or is it about growing what is good for your local population and letting the economics be a less important driver? We also needed, once we got the visions, we needed to ground truth where we were today. So we've done a lot of research around establishing how agriculture and climate smartness work in the field and how food systems work in the field. And we pull all of this together, and I'll come on to this in a bit more detail in a minute, in effectively a decision support framework called iFeed, which is about an integrated assessment of all of these bits of evidence, the scenarios work and the climate modeling and the crop modeling and the on the ground field work research. How do we pull that all together into iFeed to make that information available for policymakers who have to make the decisions? And of course, policymakers are free to make whatever decision they want, but our aim was not to channel them in a certain direction, but to provide them with the information that at least if they want to go in the direction of greater maize monocropping, they will understand the implications it will have for climate resilience, for greenhouse gas emissions, perhaps biodiversity loss, food and nutrition security, and so on. And then the final part was around de-risking policy by engaging properly with policymakers and giving them the tools to think about what are the downsides of any policy that they put in place, and therefore taking some of the risks out of policy development. And of course, that very much involved participatory work in our focal countries. So just a little bit more about iFeed. iFeed is a fantastic framework. Stuart Jennings and Andy Challoner have led this, and hopefully it will continue way beyond AFRICAP and be spread as a kind of conceptual basis into multiple countries into the future. But it's a matter of determining scenarios for the future, so the vision for your agricultural system in the future or food system in the future, doing some integrated modeling about what the consequences of those assumptions you make about the future are, bring in other research and integrate it by having a wide participatory process that's very transdisciplinary to put all of the pieces together, and then use that to go from here is some evidence, here are the implications for policy, to here is something that's user-friendly out at this end of the approach. And all the way through, this is not led by academics, this is led by what the views of people on the ground about the visions that they want. Yes, the academics are doing the kind of some of the technical work, but it is always shaped by co-design, participation, co-ownership with multiple different groups and so on. So it's very much a people-led, user-led modeling framework. And there is a link here to, and there's a nice video on the website that you can look at if you want more information. So we developed, right at the start, we developed locally specific scenarios for how countries thought about what will shape their agriculture into the future. And in each of our 4 focal countries, climate risks were seen to be a very important driver. That we know climate's going to be important, but we don't know whether the risks will be small, depending on COP and Paris alignment, or whether the risks will be large. And in each country, a second axis was chosen beyond climate risks. In South Africa, it was about land reform, going from little land reform to extensive land reform. In Tanzania, it was about access and adoption of new technologies, going from no technology, where we are today, into the future, to very strong technological innovation. In Zambia, it was about integration and market access. So are you producing just for your local market, or are you in a globalized market where you're doing a lot of trade with the world? And then in Malawi, the final axis, the second key axis, was around policy. And it's about whether policy was developed in an aligned and coherent way. So if you're developing policy for trade to say we should grow these crops, are you also developing the requisite policy for nutrition, so those two axes are not fighting against each other? So just briefly, because I'm already running out of time, just some flavour of the results. This is for South Africa under low land reform or lots of land reform, crops, meat, and yields under low and high climate scenarios. Just to pinpoint one result, to get to this point here, this is the scenario of little land reform under high climate risk. The stakeholders involved in the process said, well, if we know we're going into a high climate risk world, we'll invest more in agriculture, agricultural climate smartness, we'll invest more in irrigation and so on. So to get to that scenario, you need to make assumptions about the technology that vision will give you. And because of that, if you look under a high climate risk versus a low climate risk scenario for crop production, actually you get bigger crop yields because there's more investment because the risk is perceived to be higher. But if you have a low land reform versus a high land reform, because you are changing the way that land is used and the extensive nature of land, you end up with a different form of production level change. And that is not directly related to the way crops respond to climate, but that's related to the ways crops respond to the technology and to the amount of land that's used. So it's an integrated scenario rather than just a simple, this is how crops respond to climate. We also did a whole load of Jenny McDermott in Aberdeen and Richard King in Chatham House did a whole load of work looking at, well, if crops are being grown in this way, what does this mean for the nutrition security of the population? And this figure's too complicated to go through now, but effectively it's looking at a whole range of different nutrients down the bars, and where it's red, there isn't enough for the population. Where it's green, there is enough for the population under current climate, and then future climates are the colored diamonds. And what you can see if you do these analyses, that if you go ahead to 2050 under a scenario of particular land use and a particular amount of climate change, then you can say, well, we'll be growing these sorts of crops. Oh, but look, we won't have enough calcium in people's diets. So that calcium would then have to be made up by growing, importing more food from overseas. So it creates an import dependency that the agricultural development might be growing more crops that are exportable, but it also relies on more crops coming in for food security, nutrition security particularly. And likewise, we've done a lot of individual modeling work around, and again, this is an example for South Africa, looking to see what is the risk of extreme weather coming through. And that requires us to explore today's climate, because with only 100 years of historical record, probably less in particular countries, the chance of detecting or experiencing a 1 in 500 event is very, very small, obviously, from a statistical perspective. So what today's climate, if you run it for 30,000 years, you get a feeling for what the real risks are. And this graph shows the number of days of extreme heat in South Africa. For the black bars are what we know, what we've observed. The blue bars are what today's climate effectively allows us to suggest is real. And then these brown bars are mid-century high climate risk modeling. And what you can see is the number of days of extreme heat through the growing season practically double. And of course, then that leads to, when you look at the coupled crop climate models, that leads to risks where the crop failure rate increases, and we have maize in red and soybean for South Africa here. Effectively today's climate, and then low climate risk, high climate risk. And what you can see is that in future, the crop failure rate is effectively going to double for maize and soybean in South Africa. So I'm afraid I don't have time to go through the richness of detail, but that gives you a flavor. What I'd recommend you do, if you've got time, is go to the iFeed website and look at the way that we have taken the science results from the modelling, quantitative results, some of the more qualitative results, put them together in terms of the implications for what it means for policy, and for a whole range of the different countries and different areas, trade and agriculture and so on, we have got summary documents that show what we think our major conclusions are. And from my perspective, just trying to summarize this impossible task, my overall take-homes were, from the project as a whole, alternative futures, we know, we're experiencing it today, are very real and we have to plan for them. That means we have to take into account the way that the future might evolve, and today's world is not necessarily going to be the same as tomorrow, so we've got to plan for that in our research. We know climate is impacting and will impact further, so we have to build climate resilience. This requires that we think across policy areas, because there are trade-offs between maximising economic growth, particularly through trade, and maximising local food and nutrition security, or maximising resilience. And so navigating those trade-offs really requires capacity building in systems approaches, as we'd say in the academic world. And that is not just for us as interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary scientists, it's also in terms of building the capacity for systemic analyses and systemic understanding in the policy community, because they are key. And then final slide, just some thoughts about the kind of non-academic bit. The overall success of AFRICAP depended on us working in equal partnerships, co-design across all of our institutions, North and South, and equal ownership in the global South. It was not a Leeds Northern project recruiting partners to work for us in the global South. It was a jointly developed and owned project. The participatory processes, in the sense of bringing stakeholders in, bringing the partners together, having conversations and dialogues, was really important. And again, it's not a matter of us as academics being experts telling people what to do. And equally, it wasn't a matter of policymakers telling experts what results they needed. It was a process of mutual learning and understanding that led us to where we were. It was very important from a non-research perspective, as well as a research perspective, to build capacity, both in the UK institutions and in the South. And that is not about kind of gluing people together. It is about, again, the mutual understanding of how people in different fields shape the problems, think about the evidence, and can put them together to come up with some sort of, I wouldn't say consensus necessarily, but some sort of agreed position about what the research agenda should be, what the uncertainties about the future should be. And of course, this is only possible with teamwork, which are built on relationships of trust, and AFRICAP came about because of previous multiple years of investment at the University of Leeds, building networks in the global South. So we had a community of friends that we could then take forward the ideas within the time frame of writing the grant. And then I think my final point is that project management is absolutely essential, and for many academics, they see project management as an extra cost, but this would not have been possible without Helen Kosker and team to manage this in the North, and Tembi and team in the South to manage the way that all of the complex parts fit together. And then finally, to make this work, we needed to bend the institution around it being such a big and such a complex project. And thanks very much to the University of Leeds for investing so much time and effort in trying to get it right, and the individual faculties for working together to deliver that. So I think that's me. And of course, thanks to the whole AFRICAP family. It's been a delight and a joy to be on this journey together. So I will stop sharing the screen and we can now move on to questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Tim. There's a couple of questions in the chat. If you've got any questions, please post them in the chat and we can work through them. There's a comment, first of all, from Miles, who says he works in product development and he concurs that most of the clients in the last 12 months have asked to bring production to the UK to be more reliable and resilient. I wonder if I could just add to that. Is that going to affect trade in terms of if a lot of things are going to be moved in country? Is that going to have a significant effect?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is what we're pondering at the moment. We've published a report last week about the immediate consequences of the war. But if you just think about the complexity of supply chains for whether it's semiconductors or global food or energy or whatever, if we try to onshore those within a kind of European context or within a regional context, it will obviously make a big difference to global trading patterns and therefore price. And one of the interesting consequences that is worth thinking through is if we end up with a bipolar world of effectively a Europe and North America versus China and Russia on the other side, with African countries either aligning with one or the other in majority, what does that mean for kind of who exports to who imports from whom, and at what price? And in a world where resilience is increasingly important, the regionalization aspect, so the ability of African countries to trade with each other, is going to be really more important, whereas 10 years ago, it was much more about globalized trade, as now might be more about regionalized trade. But that means growing different things in different ways and making sure the transport infrastructure is different, because you'll be doing more land-based transport if you're commuting, if you're navigating Africa to Africa, as opposed to, you know, taking everything to the seaboards and then putting it on the tankers to go to Europe or whatever. Okay,
thank you very much. We have a question here from Nailadzi. Apologies if I've pronounced that really poorly. So they're from the Botswana University of Agriculture, and they ask if there's do you think there's for developing countries, small-scale farmers with forgotten or marginalized traditional crops can play a role in future systems?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think part of the challenge, if you imagine a smaller scale regionalized food system, you would have to grow a greater diversity of crops and get away from the large scale monocultural plantations, intensive agriculture. And there are many benefits, I think, to be had from having a much greater spread, that we invest far more in research terms and in policy terms about supporting a diversity of resilient smallholder farms, making them more climate resilient, and not just putting all of our focus and effort into growing the bigger crops for the global commodity markets. So I think there is a kind of intrinsic trade-off there, that the more regionalized, the more willing you are to think about not ignoring the smallholder farmers. And that's increasingly true, I think, in the global north as well.
Okay, cool, thank you. There's also a comment here about iFeed. They say it seems that iFeed is mitigation orientated, whereas one would have expected that the tool should be more towards adaptation for developing countries.
No, I would say it's more adaptation orientated than mitigation. It's got some analysis of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's primarily about what crops should you be growing to minimize your kind of climate risks, or what are your climate risks given the scenarios of climate change into the future, and therefore how can you adapt by building climate smartness into the system, such as through irrigation or whatever it might be, seed systems.
Okay. There's a comment too about the uncertainties around the level of confidence in the climate change output. Because we know the models, those are quite dirty. I wonder if you can comment on that.
Quite dirty. Well, I think there is uncertainty about every dimension about the future. So, you know, the geopolitical implications of Ukraine might be more detrimental to local food security than the niceties of whether the models are 80% precise or 80% accurate or 100% accurate. And clearly, the models do not yet incorporate some of the land climate, upper atmospheric interactions, such as, you know, where the jet stream meanders, etc. That's not particularly well captured yet. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the future, but I think the uncertainty is really not so much in the climate itself, but whether or not we are going to tackle getting close to Paris And if we are going to tackle getting close to Paris, that has significant implications on agriculture and what we should be growing. So instead of thinking about how do we grow more productivity, we should be thinking a lot more about what should we grow, where should we grow it, how much should we grow, and how should we grow it? And those 4 questions are normally ignored in this debate.
All right, thank you. There's a question here from Simon Gibbons, who asked that, do you think that local markets for agricultural products and nutritious diets can be strengthened by a push from local changes, or will local market needs need to pull on the production?
Well, either and both, I would say. Well, so part of the kind of the political situation is that we've had really over the last 30 years, we've had the kind of notion that the world should get more globalized, should get more interconnected, and the answer to everything in economic development is to grow more in agriculture. And therefore you tend to focus your investments into pushing agriculture into large scale for export. But what we're finding now is that the world is so much more fragile, and by the large scale agriculture is not meeting our nutritional needs because our diets are so bad. We have to get back somehow to thinking about how to maximize the nutritional diversity and make the system work so farmers can make a profit out of that. So I think there will be some top-down push, and hopefully there will be also some pull from consumers and citizens and producers to say we want the system to be better because we need to either manage our cash flow, stop ourselves from starving, or eat a healthy diet, depending on the context.
Is the push for fair trade going to have a major impact on this in terms of increasing the costs for all of these, all of this agriculture?
Well, as per my earlier, Ukraine-Russia is going to increase the costs. So the question is, I'm talking to George Eustice, our agriculture minister, tomorrow. The question is, do you say, well, we've got to mitigate the cost pressures now by doing the wrong thing? Or do you say, well, given that costs are going to rise, how can we develop social safety nets? How can we put in place the necessary things that we come out of the crisis on the other side with a food system that is better, because we know our current food system is failing? And so I think there is an element that we need to just throw our 30, 40 years of just thinking about making food cheaper and more available and not worrying about the quality away, and thinking, how can we help households be able to eat healthily, and how can we make it possible for farmers to develop a livelihood in producing the right sorts of foods in the right sorts of way?
Okay, well, thank you. There's a question from Miles Bates, who says that you've touched on this, but do you see regenerative agriculture to be the way forward?
Yeah, very much. Well, very much in depending on how you define regenerative agriculture. And I'm actually giving a seminar tomorrow on the assumptions made about defining what sustainable agriculture is, and it's all to do with the market dynamics on a global basis. And I think that it is perfectly possible to have a much more sustainable agriculture that produces enough food to feed everybody nutritiously and could make a profit for farmers, which is not based on this intensive large-scale agriculture that is climate irresilient and producing food that is calorie rich but nutrition poor.
Okay, all right, thank you. There's I think it might be more of a comment than a question from Rita Bodie here about while working for my research, they said they've witnessed the change in land and production when it's incorporated with organic farming. Actually, they've posted a question now: why can't we indulge in production of 2 or 3 crops at a time on the same piece of land and utilize the nutrients that way?
Yes, well, we certainly can. And I mean, if you look at the growth of agroforestry or double cropping on a global basis, it's starting to become, I wouldn't say mainstream, but it's certainly, I remember a conversation in DEFRA 15 years ago where they said, we'd never support agroforestry because it's too niche. And now in many parts of the world, people are seeing it as a means of building resilience and building soil carbon and moving towards net zero and so on. So I think the science is there. that we can do better. The challenge that we have to deal with on a global basis is if there is ever increasing demand for food created by our food system, not created by the pressure of the population size, but created by the food system, encouraging us to eat more and throw away more and buy more, etc., which is the way that the globe has gone. How do we manage that demand side issue? Because if we don't tackle the demand side at some point, we will cross all the planetary boundaries and we will continue driving ill health, and the undernutrition issues in the global south will go away, but they will be, as they are already, increasingly be replaced by obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease and so on.
All right, yeah. There's a question here from Simon Manda, who asked that you mentioned markets in Zambia, but would you elaborate how this plays out in reality and what level are the concerns?
So I think particularly for Zambia, because it's a big agricultural land suitability, I mean, it's got a lot of land that is agriculturally suitable. The question about the future is, are people producing for local markets, or is there a large-scale export orientation of Zambian agriculture for export? And that might mean that local markets then become deficient of the goods and the needs that they would need for local nutrition security. And of course, if you're producing crops primarily for export, you have to produce the crops that the export world demands. And that's not necessarily the crops that you should be producing from a climate resilience perspective and so on. So that level of, are we really feeding our people, or are we making money on the global basis is at the heart of that axis.
Okay, thank you. So I think I have time for one last question from Antoinette. How can food security be better understood by policy leaders in the current Ukraine-Russia conflict? Yeah,
well, without pointing you again at the paper that we published last week, there is a lot of entrenched power and political incumbency and ideology that means that people want to do the wrong thing, frankly. So across Europe, we're having large-scale farming organizations saying food security is important, therefore we have to plow up all the land for nature. And what is meant under those circumstances of food security is that we have to grow more and more to meet market demand. You can also reframe the question that actually, if we changed our diet a very small amount, so if we reduced in Europe the consumption of pigs and chicken by about 15%, it makes up for all of the grain that we would have imported from Ukraine anyway. So as also with the energy debate, politicians love the economic realities of making demand grow and having jobs and profits to meet that demand. Whereas when you're thinking about planetary boundaries and all the rest of that, at some stage you've got to say, well, the demand can only grow so much before everything falls apart. So the issue is not really about understanding food security. It's about how that term is conscripted by special interest groups to defend their area because there's a kind of conflict of interest. So industry in general loves the idea of producing more. And as we're seeing with the energy spike, some governments are saying, oh, well, we've got to drill more oil, but that's not going to come on stream for 20 years. That's not going to deal with today's crisis. No one is saying, well, we've got to insulate our homes so we use less gas.
Yeah, I think a few people have been trying to make that point, but it so far hasn't landed.
Yeah.
Right. We have run out of time now, but thank you very much, Professor Benton, for an excellent talk. Hope everyone here has enjoyed it. We will be making the video available. Please take a look at the Twitter feed and the rest of the seminar series on the link that's just been posted in the chat. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.